In the heart of the vast savanna, under the scorching heat of the African sun, lay a village that once thrived with life, laughter, and prosperity. The people of this village were known for their strong sense of community, their rich cultural traditions, and their deep connection to the land. But all of that changed the day the sickness came. It began with a faint whisper in the wind, a strange disease that swept through the land, leaving no one untouched. The old herbal remedies no longer worked, and the spirits of the ancestors seemed to have turned their backs on the people. Despair settled over the village like a heavy fog, choking out any hope of salvation. For years, the elders tried to protect the young women, teaching them the ways of their ancestors and preserving the sacred traditions of purity and modesty. But as the disease continued to ravage their bodies and minds, a new plague began to take hold, one that was more insidious than any sickness. It was the decay of the soul. One by one, the young girls of the village, bright-eyed and full of potential, began to change. They no longer gathered around the fire to hear the stories of their grandmothers. They no longer sang the songs of their people or participated in the dances that had been passed down through the generations. Instead, they found themselves drawn to the promises of quick wealth and fleeting pleasure that came from the strangers who visited their village, bringing with them foreign goods and foreign ways. In the beginning, it was just a few. A girl here and there, tempted by the allure of the outsiders who spoke of new worlds and new opportunities. But soon, the practice spread like wildfire, infecting every corner of the village. The girls, once cherished and protected, became commodities in the eyes of the men who came to exploit them. The elders, helpless and bewildered, watched as their daughters and granddaughters turned away from the values they had been taught, selling their bodies in exchange for the trinkets and treasures that promised a life of luxury. At first, the village leaders were in denial. They refused to believe that their beloved daughters, the future of their people, could ever fall to such depths. But the evidence was undeniable. Every night, the cries of the young girls echoed through the village, as they surrendered to the men who promised them everything but gave them nothing in return. By the time the rains came, it was too late. The village was no longer the place of joy it once had been. The women once revered as the lifeblood of the community had become pawns in a game they did not understand. The men, desperate and driven by their own shame, no longer spoke of the pride they once had in their daughters. They turned away, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that their daughters were lost to them forever. In the midst of this chaos, there was one girl who refused to give in. Her name was Amina, and she had always been different. From a young age, she was known for her strength and intelligence. She was the daughter of the village healer, and her mother had instilled in her the ancient wisdom of their people. Amina knew that the path the other girls had taken was not their true destiny, and she vowed to fight against it. But Amina was not alone in her fight. There were other girls who had not yet fallen prey to the temptations of the outsiders. They were the last hope of the village, the ones who still held onto the values of their ancestors, and they knew that if they did not act soon, there would be no future for their people. Amina gathered them together in secret, away from the watchful eyes of the men who had become their captors. They met in the forest at night, under the cover of darkness, where they could speak freely without fear of being overheard. Amina spoke of hope, of the power of the ancestors, and of the strength that lay within each of them. She told them that they had the ability to break free from the chains that bound them, but they would need to stand together. "You are not lost," Amina said, her voice steady and unwavering. "We are the daughters of this land, and we carry the blood of our ancestors within us. They did not endure the trials of the past so that we could fall into this darkness. We must fight for our future, for the future of our people." The girls listened, their faces filled with both fear and hope. They knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but they also knew that Amina was right. If they did nothing, if they allowed the disease of the soul to spread any further, there would be no village left to save. As the days passed, Amina and her band of girls began to make their plans. They would need to act quickly, for the sickness had already taken hold of the elders and the men, leaving the village vulnerable to those who sought to exploit it further. They would need to reclaim their power, to fight back against the forces that had torn their world apart. But there was a danger greater than the outsiders, greater than the disease, that lay ahead. Amina knew that to defeat this plague, they would need to confront the darkness that had taken root within their own hearts. And so, as the village continued its descent into chaos, Amina and her sisters in spirit prepared for the battle that would determine the fate of their people. They would not allow their village to become a place where every girl was reduced to a prostitute. They would rise, no matter the cost. The moon hung high in the sky, a silver lantern casting pale light on the dusty ground of the village. The once vibrant homes, built with care by generations of skilled hands, now stood crumbling, as if the very earth had begun to reject them. Amina walked through the streets, her footsteps silent in the still night, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. It had been weeks since the first meeting in the forest, and already, the girls were showing signs of change. They were no longer the frightened, hesitant souls they had been in the beginning. Amina had ignited something in them, a fire that burned brighter with each passing day. They had begun to reclaim their sense of self-worth, rejecting the promises of wealth and pleasure that had been offered by the outsiders. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. In the distance, the flickering light of the men's gathering fire cast an eerie glow on the surrounding landscape. Amina's heart tightened at the sight. The men of the village, once the protectors and providers, now sat idly, their faces filled with apathy and sorrow. They had given up hope. They no longer spoke of fighting the disease that had crippled their land, they only spoke of survival, of waiting for the next foreign visitor to bring them more goods to barter with. But Amina knew that survival was not enough. To live, they needed purpose. To heal, they needed unity. And that was the battle she had to win. She paused at the edge of the village, looking out over the vast expanse of the savannah. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it the scent of the earth and the promise of renewal. The land was dying, but there was still a pulse within it, a pulse that Amina could feel deep in her bones. She could hear the voice of her ancestors calling to her, urging her to continue, to not let the darkness consume them all. But how could she do it alone? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife at her waist. But the figure that emerged from the shadows was not one of the outsiders. It was Zui, one of the girls she had gathered in the forest. Zui was younger than Amina, but her determination matched her own. Her eyes, bright and full of defiance, had not dulled despite the heavy burden she carried. Like the others, Zui had once been caught in the web of the outsiders' promises, but she had found her way back, following Amina's lead. "I've been watching the men," Zui said, her voice low but steady. "They've become completely numb. I overheard them speaking of selling the last of the land to the foreigners. They are ready to give everything up." Amina clenched her fists. The men had fallen so far, they no longer cared for the future of their people. The land, their sacred home, was now just another commodity to be bartered for. The thought of it was too much to bear. "We won't let that happen," Amina said, her voice fierce, her resolve hardening like stone. "We cannot afford to wait any longer. We need to act now." Zui nodded. "What do we do?" Amina's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent countless hours thinking of a way to stop the tide of destruction that was swallowing their world, but the answer had always eluded her. Now, standing here in the quiet of the night, with the weight of the village's future on her shoulders, the answer seemed so clear. "We begin with the women," Amina said, her voice firm. "We need to remind them of who they are. We need to show them that they are not the property of outsiders. They are the daughters of this land, and they have the power to heal it." Zui's eyes sparkled with understanding. "But how do we reach them? They are lost in the temptation of wealth and power. How do we show them the truth?" Amina took a deep breath, her gaze steady as she looked out across the village. "We show them through action, not words. We reclaim what has been stolen from us: our traditions, our dignity, and our connection to the land. We bring back the ceremonies, the dances, the stories of our ancestors. We remind them of their purpose. And we do it together." Zui's expression hardened with determination. "We can do it. We'll make them remember." Together, they turned and walked toward the heart of the village. They knew the path ahead would not be easy. There would be obstacles, those who resisted, those who were too far gone to return. But Amina had faith in the strength of her people. The fire she had ignited would not be extinguished by the wind. As they approached the gathering place of the girls, Amina's mind returned to the wisdom of her mother, the healer of their people. Her mother had always taught her that healing required patience, but it also required strength. You could not wait for the disease to leave on its own. You had to fight it, face it head on, and confront it at its source. Amina had seen the sickness of the land, the sickness of the people. But she also knew that there was another sickness, one that ran deeper than any disease. It was the sickness of the spirit, of the soul. And that was the most dangerous kind. She would fight it. The girls were waiting for her in the center of the village, their faces lit by the flickering firelight. They had come together as Amina had asked, and their eyes, once filled with doubt and fear, now held a quiet determination. Amina stepped forward, her presence commanding their attention. She raised her hand, and the crowd fell silent. "Tonight, we begin to heal," she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong in the night air. "Tonight, we reclaim what is ours. We are the daughters of this land, and we will rise together." And as the fire crackled and the wind whispered, the girls gathered around her, ready to begin the long journey back to the heart of their people. Continuing Amina's journey as she takes action to reclaim the village's spirit and culture, while facing further challenges along the way. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the village. The once barren landscape now seemed alive with the promise of a new beginning. The air was thick with the scent of earth and dew, and the birds chirped in unison, as though welcoming the day. The village was still, but beneath the silence lay an undercurrent of anticipation. Amina stood at the edge of the village, overlooking the fields where her people once toiled in unity. Her heart swelled with both hope and uncertainty. Today was the day they would begin to reclaim their heritage. Today, they would attempt what many thought was impossible. They would awaken the soul of the village, and with it, the spirit of their ancestors. She could feel the eyes of the girls upon her, all gathered in a circle, waiting for her guidance. They had prepared for this moment for days, gathering herbs, creating offerings, and practicing the sacred dances that had been passed down through generations. Every step they took was deliberate, every gesture infused with the weight of history. They had not only come to restore their village, but to restore themselves. Amina took a deep breath and turned to face them. Their faces were a reflection of the courage and fear that had brought them here. Each of them was ready, yet the air still crackled with uncertainty. Would they be able to call upon the spirits of their ancestors? Would they be able to break free from the grip of the outsiders and the disease that had ravaged them? We are daughters of the earth, Amina said, her voice steady and strong, as though drawing strength from the land beneath her feet. We are the keepers of the wisdom of our ancestors. Today, we call upon them. We honor their memory and their teachings. Through this ceremony, we will remind ourselves who we are and where we come from. The girls nodded, their faces a mixture of resolve and reverence. Together, they began to move toward the center of the village, where a small clearing had been prepared. The ground was cleared of debris, and a large fire pit had been made. Around the fire, a circle of stones had been placed, each one representing the different tribes that once thrived here, the 7 tribes that had lived in harmony with the land and with each other. These were the tribes that Amina sought to unite once more. As they gathered around the fire, Amina took her place at the head of the circle. She could feel the weight of the ritual, the gravity of what they were about to do. Her mother had always told her that the greatest power lay in unity, the power of the people, of the land, and of the spirits who walked among them. She believed it, but today, she would test that belief. Amina raised her hands to the sky, calling for the spirits of the ancestors to join them. Mothers and fathers of our people, hear us. She cried. We are your daughters, your sons, your descendants. We ask for your strength, your guidance, and your protection. Bring us your wisdom and your healing power. We are ready to listen. For a long moment, there was silence, a stillness that stretched between the girls and the spirits they called upon. It was as though the earth itself held its breath, waiting. And then, from the wind, came a soft rustling, like the whisper of 1,000 voices. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, clearer. Softly at first, and then louder, their voices rising in unison, echoing through the village like the pulse of the earth itself. The dance began slow, deliberate steps that had been forgotten by many, but now returned to them as though they had never been lost. Amina stepped into the circle, her movements fluid and graceful. She could feel the energy surging within her, filling her with the power of her ancestors. She danced with the girls, her feet moving in rhythm with the earth, her heart beating in time with the sacred songs that had once been sung by the women of her tribe. The fire crackled, its flames reaching toward the sky as though eager to join the spirits. The wind swept through the circle, carrying with it the scent of the land, of the grass, the soil, and the trees. It was as though the entire village had come alive, as though the land itself had remembered who it was and who it had been. For hours, they danced and chanted, moving together as one. Sweat beaded on their foreheads, but there was no fatigue, only the sense that they were part of something greater than themselves. It was as if the ceremony had awakened something deep within them, something ancient and powerful. When the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows over the village, Amina and the girls slowed their movements. The energy in the air had shifted, it was no longer frantic or desperate, but calm, like the stillness after a storm. Amina stood still, breathing heavily, her heart still racing. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as though the spirits had answered their call. The land had heard them, and they had begun to heal. The ceremony was not just a return to tradition, it was a reclaiming of their power, their identity, and their future. But as the last notes of the chant faded into the evening air, Amina knew that the journey was far from over. The men, the outsiders, and the disease still lurked in the shadows. There would be those who resisted, those who clung to the promises of the foreign world, unwilling to let go of the illusions that had been planted in their minds. Yet Amina stood strong. This was only the beginning. The spirit of the land had been awakened, and with it, the strength of the people. The battle to reclaim their home would not be won overnight, but with each ceremony, each step they took together, they would move closer to healing. Amina turned to the girls, their faces alight with the same determination that burned within her. "This is just the start," she said, her voice quiet but filled with resolve. "We will not stop until our land is whole again. Until every soul is free." The fire crackled one last time, sending a spray of sparks into the night sky. And as the stars blinked into existence overhead, the village stood in silence, alive, hopeful, and ready to rise once more. The days that followed the ceremony were heavy with the weight of their actions. The village, though stirred by the sacred dance and chants, was still in the grips of a slow and creeping malaise. While the girls' spirits had been lifted, the rest of the community was not so easily swayed. Amina knew that the hardest part of their fight was still ahead of them. The battle for the village's soul had only just begun. The first sign of trouble came in the form of the elders. Amina had expected this, but the sharpness of their disapproval still stung. They had been the guardians of the old ways, the ones who spoke of balance and patience, of waiting for the healing powers of the ancestors to manifest in their own time. The ceremony had been a radical break from the traditional methods they had long adhered to. Amina stood in the village square, her feet planted firmly on the earth, as the elders approached her. They moved with the deliberate pace of those who had carried the weight of knowledge and tradition for generations. The air between them crackled with tension. "Amina," said Chief Mwanga, the eldest of the group, his voice gravelly from age but still commanding, "what you have done has shaken this village to its core. These ceremonies, these dances, are not our way. The ancestors speak to us in silence, not through the fire and noise of the outsiders' rituals." Amina's heart pounded, but her voice was steady. "Chief Mwanga, we have listened to silence for too long. The spirits are not distant from us. They are here, in the land, in the wind, in the fire. We have only to listen with our hearts." "But you have disrupted the order," another elder, Mama Kozi, interjected, her face shadowed with concern. "You have given them false hope. These girls, these children believe in the power of their feet, their voices, their songs, but they forget the price of such things. The disease still plagues us, and your ceremonies cannot erase that. You cannot rush the healing of this land." Amina took a deep breath. "I know the sickness is not gone. But the sickness of the spirit is the first to be healed. If we do not reclaim our culture, our strength, we will lose everything. We will never be able to heal the land if we cannot first heal ourselves." Chief Mwanga's brow furrowed. "The land will heal in its own time, child. The ancestors will not be summoned by force. You must trust in the old ways." Amina shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "The land has already begun to heal. You can feel it. You can see it in the grass, in the trees. We can no longer wait. If we wait any longer, there will be nothing left to save." The elders exchanged looks, their faces etched with both doubt and a grudging respect for Amina's conviction. But they did not relent. "This village has endured centuries of hardship, and we will not be rushed," Chief Mwanga said, his voice final. "The outsiders' ways are not our ways. We must resist them, and that means we must resist you as well." With that, the elders turned and left her standing in the square. Amina watched them go, her heart heavy with the weight of their disapproval. She had expected resistance from the elders, but the coldness in their eyes left her unsettled. They were the keepers of the past, but their refusal to embrace change could very well doom them all. It was then that she realized the true depth of her struggle. The outsiders were not the only enemy they faced. The disease, yes, it ravaged the bodies of the people, but the disease of fear, of tradition without progress, was far more insidious. The elders held tightly to the past, unable to see that the land itself had changed, and so too must they. As she walked back to the gathering of girls, Amina felt a sense of urgency she hadn't known before. Time was running out, and every delay, every hesitation, would only make the journey ahead that much harder. That evening, the girls gathered once again by the fire, where they had held the ceremony days before. Amina joined them, her expression determined. The resistance from the elders had shaken her, but it also strengthened her resolve. She could not afford to lose the momentum they had built. "I know things are hard," Amina said, her voice carrying the weight of her inner struggle. "The elders do not understand what we are doing. They are afraid. Afraid of what change might bring, of what it might cost them. But we cannot stop now." Zee, who had been standing silently by Amina's side, spoke up. "What if they try to stop us? What if they tell the men to punish us for what we've done?" Amina's gaze softened. "We must stay united. If the elders turn against us, we will need the strength of each other to carry us forward. And if the men turn against us, we will remind them who we are. We are the daughters of this land. We do not fear them." The girls nodded in agreement, their faces set in determination. They had seen the power of their collective spirit during the ceremony, and they would not let the elders' fear stop them. The darkness that had descended on the village was not just physical, it was mental, emotional, and spiritual. It was a darkness that could only be overcome by the light they had kindled in themselves. But the next day brought new challenges. Amina heard whispers on the wind foreigners had returned to the village, bringing with them more goods and promises of wealth. They had come to offer trade, but Amina knew their true intentions. The men of the village, already weakened by despair, would be easily swayed by the outsider's charm. She knew it was time to confront the men, to break the cycle of dependency that had been forged in the village over the years. But as she approached the gathering place, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what was to come, Amina could not shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The men stood in a circle around the foreigners, laughing and bartering over trinkets and food. Their eyes were glazed with greed, their voices too loud, too eager. Amina's stomach twisted at the sight. She approached them, her step steady, her resolve clear. As she neared, one of the men, Osei, the village's former hunter, looked up. His eyes were filled with something she had not seen before: indifference. "Amina," he said, his voice flat. "The world is changing. These men have what we need. The elders say we must protect our ways, but how can we protect a dying village?" Her heart clenched. The disease had spread deeper than she had thought. The men had surrendered their souls to the promise of a new life. "We do not protect what is dying, Osei," Amina said, her voice rising above the noise of the crowd. "We protect what is alive. And we will not trade our future for your scraps." A tense silence fell over the group as Amina's words settled into the air. The men exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. But the foreigners remained silent, watching the scene unfold with quiet amusement. Amina knew this was just the beginning. She had opened a wound in the heart of the village, and it would not heal without a fight.